All right, well, we got so much to talk about. Now, last time I actually had a chance to present you my own views for a change. Instead of you telling you other people's opinions and what's wrong with them, I had a chance to tell you my views. And I think it's kind of obvious if you think about what we know about ourselves and about what little we know about how the brain works. We know that it does cause us to be conscious. We know that consciousness is real. We know that it's going on in the brain. And we know that it functions causally. However, there are lots of problems with any such a view, and let me tell you, I mentioned some of them. Now, let me, first of all, say, why isn't this obvious to everybody? I mean, why is it that I have so much trouble getting this across? It's not like the Chinese room. In the case of strong AI, I had to deal against an established institution of people who had a professional commitment to the idea that all you need to know to study the mind is digital computer programming. You don't really need to know about the brain or any of that hard stuff. You just have to be a good programmer, and you can sit in front of a console and create a mind. And I'm not joking. People actually thought that. I mean, future generations will regard us as ridiculous that we thought any such a thing. But in any case, there were people who thought that. But in the case of the mind-body problem overall, how does consciousness relate to the brain? There's a long philosophical tradition that I'm militating against. It isn't just that there's research money for artificial intelligence. There's a long philosophical tradition, and it's not a dumb tradition, but it does involve certain assumptions about causation and about identity, and most importantly of all, about the mental and the physical and reduction. And I have to challenge that tradition. And in a way, the whole course is a matter of challenging that tradition. And one of the things I do in that little book, Mind, is you write all the features that are supposed to be special to the mind on the left-hand side of the page, and you write all the features that are supposed to be special to the body on the right-hand side of the page, and then the ones that are false about consciousness, that it hasn't got a spatial location, it doesn't have an electrical charge, it doesn't have any dimensions. It does have all of those things. Your conscious states are located in your brain. We can actually find where they're located with fMRI. I mean, it's kind of a crude tool, but it's better than nothing. They do have a certain electrical charges. We're finding out more about that kind of stuff. And they have all of these other so-called physical features. But the features that are really special, namely qualitativeness and subjectivity, the fact that there's this touchy-feel quality to consciousness, the answer is move them over to the right-hand side. Move them over along with weight and force, mass, and gravitational attraction. They're just features of our biological life. It's just a fact about our biology that we have consciousness the same way we have mitosis, digestion, and all the rest of it. And if you go through the organic life, we have photosynthesis and growth and all of the phenomena that are typical of biology. Consciousness is just another biological feature. Now, I have no problem convincing neurobiologists of that. They are perfectly happy with that. But with professional philosophers, it's tougher. And you might say, well, that's just because the neurobiologists are dumb. They don't know the history. And it's true, they don't know the history. They've never suffered from Descartes. They don't wake up in the middle of the night thinking, my God, what would Uncle Rene say if I actually said this? They don't worry about that kind of stuff. They just get busy. Now, you might say, well, look, if these guys are working on it, then why are philosophers talking about this at all? Why isn't it just a straight neurobiological problem? You don't need philosophers to tell you how to find the cause of cancer. Why do you need philosophers to tell you about the mind-body problem? Well, in a way, I think that's right. I think in the end, we ought to kick this problem out of philosophy and let it be a scientific problem, the way the problem of life stop being part of philosophy. I mean, how is life possible? It's not a philosophical problem anymore. It used to be, but it's not anymore. And I think that will happen with the problem of consciousness. But the reason we couldn't just kick it out of philosophy is it turns out the brain stabbers are as dumb as the rest of us. They're brought up on the same Cartesian mistakes. So when I first got interested in this field, I used to go to talk to these guys at UCSF, and they had and still do have some very famous neurobiologists over there. And I told them, get busy, solve the problem of consciousness, get to work. That's what I'm paying you guys to do. And the answers were very revealing. The best, I thought, was by Ben Libet. I may have told you this already, but I'll tell you again. He said, look, in neurobiology, it's okay to be interested in consciousness, but make sure you get tenure first. Make sure that you got a solid job before you start messing around with consciousness. And then some of the other attitudes were, consciousness not a suitable subject for science. It's mystical, it's religious, it's for philosophers and theologians. I love the way they lump those two together. For philosophers and theologians, not a suitable topic for science. And then, of course, they were also victims of behaviorism. They said, well, it's really just behavior if you're a scientist. And then another mistake, a very common mistake, was, well, look, we've got to be able to reduce it. Why? Science is reductionist. That was repeated as a kind of a mantra. And so there's got to be a reduction of consciousness to brain processes described in standard neurobiological terms. Anyway, I think those days are over. And now, instead of it being the case that you got to get tenure first, a lot of people can get tenure by working on the problem of consciousness. So it's now become a respectable scientific subject. Now, a couple of things you might want to look at. I remember I told you about this program called Watson that won a game called Jeopardy. Apparently, I'm the only guy in the United States that never saw Jeopardy. But anyway, now I know more about it than I ever wanted to know. But in any case, tomorrow, the Wall Street Journal will publish my 800-word article. They asked for it, so that's what they got. And they promised it for Wednesday. Now, if you paid the Wall Street Journal tomorrow and they don't have it, don't come to me to get your money back. They told me that it would come out. The article would come out Wednesday. And also, I talked to the New York Review, and there's a review of Damasio's book on consciousness. And that will come out not in the next issue, but the one after that. So anyway, a couple of things coming out about a question we're talking about in the course. Okay, so it turns out that you have to constantly militate against philosophical mistakes made by neuroscientists, but I think those are coming to an end now. I think the sort of view that I enunciated last time, I don't care if we call it biological naturalism or not, but the idea that we ought to treat consciousness as just a natural phenomenon like any other biological phenomenon and get busy and figure out how it works. How actually does the brain cause consciousness? Where exactly is it located in the brain? And how exactly does it function in our behavior? I think those are ongoing research projects. Okay, that's all good news. Now let me tell you some of the bad news. Progress has been very slow. We're just not making a lot of progress on the subject of consciousness. And what that suggests to me is there's probably some mistake that this generation of neuroscientists is making. They're looking maybe at the wrong level. They tend to think the neuron is the right thing to study, or maybe neuronal maps. But we're probably making some mistake, and the problem will probably be solved by somebody in your generation, by somebody who's not committed to the traditional way of looking at these things in neurobiology. So anyway, that's one thing. Progress is slow. Now there's some other more metaphysically depressing features about the account of consciousness I gave you last time. And that is, if I'm right, hopes of immortality are dashed. They're roughly speaking zero. The chances that you're going to survive the destruction of your brain are about like the chances that you're going to be able to eat a lot of pizza and drink a lot of beer after your body has been destroyed. It's just not a likely prospect. And there are a lot of sort of village atheists who look forward to this and think that's absolutely great. Nothing they want better than extinction. I am not one of them. It's true, I think, when people say they'd like to live eternally, well, I think after the first few billion years, it might get to be a bore. But still, the 80 or 100 years that's allotted to us, I think, is plainly not enough, and I'd like to go on lots longer. So that's bad news from my point of view, is that extinction is whether you look forward to it, it's inevitable. Now, there's an interesting thing about religion, and as far as I know, with one possible exception, none of the great religions promise extinction. They don't say, join our religion and we guarantee future non-existence. Normally, what they promise is some form of afterlife, which on the more vigorous religions is supposed to be even more fun than the life you had here. Though there are interesting differences in the conception of fun or happiness in paradise. The Muslim conception seems to be quite different from the Christian conception. But in any case, on the view that I have been espousing, the chances of any of those coming to pass are unlikely. Okay, now I did have a student who told me, no, that in the Hindu religion, eventually you get extinction. You have to go through all these phases where you live the life as different animals, but eventually you cease to exist altogether. I don't know enough about the Hindu religion to have an opinion about that. So I used to tell my class, no religion promises extinction, and she corrected me. She said, that's not true. First you live a life as a goat, and then a flea, and then a duck, or whatever. And eventually you reach the state where you don't have to live at all. Not something I look forward to. Okay, so that's the situation that we're in regarding the overall picture of the conception that I have of consciousness and its relation to the brain. I think it's alive and well in neurobiology. You find it in practice. Well, in this book that I'm reviewing by Antonio Damasio, and in books by Gerald Edelman and Tononi. What's Tononi's first name? I think it's Giuseppe. It's an Italian name. Anyway, there are a bunch of absolutely first-rate neurobiologists. Francis Crick was another one who had essentially the conception of mind-body relations of the type that I have been advocating. Okay, so let's suppose that if I haven't convinced you of that, at least I've laid it out, so you have it on the table. Now, there are a whole lot of other questions that we need to discuss. Remember, the course divides into two halves. In the first half, which we're still in, I am describing mainstream philosophy of mind. A mainstream philosophy of mind has this obsession with the mind-body problem. And its prevailing dogma is materialism, though recently some kind of property dualism has become semi-respectable. And there are a few other notions that I have not adequately explained to you, such as supervenience and emergent properties, and I want to say a little bit about them. And that's the first half of the course. Then the second half of the course, we're going to talk about what I think is really the more important set of questions. If you get the philosophical confusions out of the way, you can actually ask, how does the mind work? And again, that's a lot of empirical issues for psychology and neurobiology involved in that. But there are a lot of philosophical issues that I want to try to discuss. And the crucial notion in asking the question, how does the mind work? The crucial notion is intentionality. Okay, so we got a whole lot of messy problems that we still have to resolve before I can go on with the second half of the course. And I'm going to just start with some of those more or less right now, but let's stop for questions. Any questions about what I just said or about stuff I said in last week's lectures? Everybody's up with us. Oh, you've handed in your first paper. I don't know if it was fun or not, but I will get you some questions for the second paper. And I still haven't figured out how Turnitin works, but I'm sure you'll figure it out, and that will make life easier for my GSIs. Okay, well, let's go on then and discuss various other issues. Now, there is an argument that I have used against materialism, and that some people use against me to try to establish property dualism. And it's called a zombie argument. And before I go into it, let me state why this is an important issue. I claim that you cannot do a reductive elimination of consciousness to neurobiological processes. You can do a causal reduction, but you cannot do an ontological reduction. And you cannot do an ontological reduction for the obvious reason that consciousness has a first person or subjective ontology, and so if you tried to reduce it to something that has a third person or objective ontology, you'd leave something out. And by the way, that is the general flavor of these arguments against materialism, whether it's Nagel's What It's Like to Be a Bat, or Jackson's What Mary Knew, or the Chinese Room, or the absent qualia argument. They all have the same logical structure. The same logical structure is that the materialist reduction leaves out something. In the Chinese Room, you leave out the understanding of Chinese. In the case of Jackson and Nagel, you leave out the subjective feelings. It's a bit trickier with Kripke and rigid designators, but I think basically it's the same idea, that you can't do this reduction with rigid designators on both sides, because it would have to be necessary, but it can't be necessary. Why not? Because the conscious feeling is something different from the objective neuronal firings. The C fiber firings just aren't the same as the conscious feeling. Another way to put this general pattern is to say, how many kinds of things are going on in there anyhow, inside your brain? Is it just objective neurobiological processes or computational states, or is there some subjective feeling going on as well? And the answer is, unless you want to deny the existence of consciousness altogether, you're forced to say that there is some subjective element, and that's what makes the materialist reductions impossible. Okay, the way the zombie argument works is this. It can't be the case that my physical and behavioral structure is sufficient for consciousness, because there could be a being exactly like me with the same behavior. It gives these lectures and so on, but which is a total zombie, which has no conscious states at all. And if that's possible, if it's even logically imaginable, then it follows that the consciousness is not the same as the physical structure and the behavioral dispositions. A zombie could have the same physical structure and the same behavioral dispositions without having any conscious states, and that proves there's something different. There are two different kinds of things going on. By the way, this is a mirror image of Descartes' argument that says, I can't be identical with my body because I can imagine my body not existing, but I can't imagine myself not existing. Now, if you kind of reverse that, I can imagine my body having exactly the same behavior, but without having me, without having my consciousness. In order to imagine me, my consciousness, I have to imagine these existing states of qualitative subjectivity. So it's not a new argument, it's an old argument, though Descartes' version has a different aim. He wants to establish that he is identical with his mind and not with his body, whereas what the zombie argument establishes in contemporary philosophy is that the purely material substance and behavior, the purely material structure and behavior is not sufficient, not constitutive of mental life. You need something more, because there could be a being that had my structure and my behavior but did not have any mental life at all. That's the zombie. A little footnote here. One of the cop-outs that's emerging in the wake of last week's great victory of the IBM computer experts over the contestants in Jeopardy is, one of the cop-outs is to say, well, really, there are two kinds of minds. There's human minds and computer minds. or there's human consciousness and machine consciousness, or human understanding and machine understanding. That's a cheat. There aren't two kinds of understanding. My understanding and the kind that exists in my car. My car has zero understanding. Even the Porsche has no understanding. I'm sorry to say that, Porsche owners, but even the 911 doesn't feel a goddamn thing. Well, I know it's hard to accept that. I won't argue about it now. But in any case, the computer has no understanding, consciousness, feelings. It doesn't play the game because it doesn't win and lose because it doesn't understand anything. It's not in that line of business. Okay, but now I think the zombie argument's a good argument. It's the same argument as we've been using in all these other cases. It says you got two kinds of things going on where human and animal life is concerned. You have the purely physical phenomena, and then you have the subjective, qualitative states of consciousness. And that they're different is shown by the fact that you could imagine a being that had all the objective stuff but had no consciousness. That's the zombie. The philosophers' zombies are beings that behave just like human beings but feel nothing. They have no mental states at all. And it's interesting to see how easily the public is fooled. There was a rather silly movie which had, was it called Star Trek? And there was a robot in it, and we're supposed to treat the robot as if it had mental states, but it was left ambiguous. Are we supposed to think of Z2A? What was his name? Yeah, was it? I forgot. Data. Okay. But in any case, the name of this robot, were we supposed to think that he had conscious states or not? If he has no conscious states, then we don't have to worry about him. If he does, then we have to ask, well, what fact about him makes him have conscious states, and the behavior is not sufficient. Okay, I'm going to extend the zombie argument and see if it proves property dualism. Now, various philosophers have extended it in this way, but I think the most prominent is probably Dave Chalmers, and he extends it as follows. If you grant me that there might be a being that looked exactly like you and had your structure and your behavior but had no consciousness, then it looks like property dualism follows. Why? Because you can imagine the whole universe having exactly the structure that it's always had, having exactly the history that it's had from the time of the Big Bang, but having no conscious states whatever. Does everybody get the picture that we have the entire history of the universe over the past 13 billion years exactly the same way that it has been, but it is without any consciousness. But now, if that's the case, then it must be that consciousness has a separate existence altogether from the physical universe, and that means, at the very least, you have to embrace property dualism. You have to say that there are two basic kinds of properties in the universe, the physical properties and the mental properties. Now they agree that the people who advance this argument that maybe some of the laws of nature would be different, the laws that produce consciousness, but all the same, you could have exactly the same physical particles in exactly the same trajectories without any consciousness whatever in the entire history of the universe, but there is consciousness in the history of the universe. Therefore, property dualism follows because there's something in the universe that cannot be accounted for or cannot be identified with the physical structure. Same physical structure, no consciousness. This physical structure, consciousness, but the physical structure is the same in both cases. Now, I think that's a bad argument, but it's tricky, and I need to slow down and go over it carefully. Okay, everybody, any questions? Everybody, I'm talking fast, but I want to make sure everybody's with us. Yes?
If we're assuming that the universe is exactly like it is today, without consciousness, are they assuming that no life came out of the universe?
Well, this is a very good question. Try the same trick with life. Suppose somebody said, you could imagine exactly the same history of the universe, exactly the way it had always been, only nothing had ever been alive. You're a born philosopher. That's a philosopher's question. I was going to make precisely that point, but you beat me to it. But let me extend it because I'm going to go further with it. But anybody, any other questions at this point? Yeah.
Maybe it's like not but I don't understand how the zombie argument can be logical. Why can you imagine a world where zombies exist that you wouldn't say the same thing with unicorns? I don't.
No, here's the point. It's just a contingent fact that there are no unicorns. I mean, maybe there's some logical reason why horses couldn't have grown one horn, but I don't know of any. And that's what a unicorn is. It's a horsey type beast with a big single horn growing out of the middle of its forehead. It's kind of fun, actually. I'd love to own a unicorn. But in any case, it's just a fact about biology that it didn't produce such beasts. Okay, now in the case, I mean, you can imagine messing around with the DNA in such a case that a horn popped out. At least I can imagine that. Animal husbandry students among you will correct me if I'm mistaken. But in any case, the whole point of the zombie argument is to establish that there are two different kinds of features in the universe. One feature are the physical features, and another set of features are the mental features. It's to establish dualism. And the argument goes that you can imagine exactly the same universe, but without any consciousness. I mean exactly the same, as philosophers like to say, down to the last molecule. Each and every molecule is the same, but there's no consciousness. Now, her point is, try the trick with life, and it doesn't work because it looks like these elements are constitutive. This arrangement is constitutive of life. So what are we going to say about the zombie argument? Okay, yes, you had a question. Yeah.
Off what you were saying, so why does it follow from something that is, from what is logically imaginable?
Yeah. What we're trying to establish, okay, now it's a good question. Who cares about these science fiction fantasies? What we're interested in is how nature actually works. But the science fiction fantasies will enable you to see logical distinctions. And the point of the distinction, just as the Chinese room is a science fiction fantasy, nobody can actually sit in a room and answer all the questions in Chinese. But the point is to get you to see the distinction between the organism described in terms of its physical structure and behavior and the organism described in terms of its mental life. And you can have that physical structure without the mental life. That's the point of the zombie argument. And that shows that the argument, the materialist argument is always, the mental life just is the physical structure. There isn't anything else there. There's just the physical structure. And the zombie argument's good against that. The zombie argument says, no, you could have a beast that looked exactly like me, that gave my lectures and all that kind of stuff, but wasn't consciousness at all, wasn't conscious at all, had no consciousness, whatever. That's the point. And the point is not, well, who knows? Maybe they're going to, if they look in the Amazon basin, they might find some zombies running around. That's not the idea. The idea is not, for all we know, there may be, at this moment, zombies living in Sausalito. No, the idea is to, as a thought experiment, to make the distinction. Okay, I want to take more questions to make sure everybody's on board because I want to answer this. Yes?
Doesn't the zombie argument kind of presuppose the fact that there's conscious states?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
But then it also shows how it's property dualism.
No, here's the point of the zombie argument. The zombie argument says, look, take my life as it is. And if somebody says, well, your consciousness as it is really reducible to computational states, that's strong AI, or it's reducible to your behavior, that's behaviorism, or it's reducible to your neurobiological states, that's type, and token identity theory. We take all of those and we show, no, you can refute those. The kind of ontological reduction that you're talking about, you can't do. Now, my own view, as you know, is kind of tricky because I'm saying there's a sense in which it is identical, but it is identical as a qualitative, subjective, irreducibly mental phenomenon. It's part of your biology. But that's not what these guys want. What these guys want is you should get rid of it altogether. And what we show is you can't get rid of it in the way you can get rid of sunsets and rainbows by an eliminative reduction. And the zombie argument is one way to show that. That's the point we're at. But have another try.
I guess it's just that when you say that, when you suppose that you can have an entity that is the same as you, exactly the same without having consciousness, you're supposing that it's possible. And to say that, then I don't understand how you're able to. I mean, you show how it's absurd.
Yeah.
But it just seems like you're supposing the thing that you want to prove. I don't know.
Oh well, here's the objection that you're making now is it looks like you're begging the question by presupposing what you want to prove. You presuppose that you're conscious. And that's right, because everybody does presuppose that. The question is, how shall we explain consciousness? Let's grant that we're conscious. How shall we explain it? And the idea is we can give an explanation which gets rid of it. See, everybody agrees we can all see the rainbow in the sky. Nobody says, well, I don't see any damn rainbow. No, we can all see the rainbow in the sky. The question is, what is it? And it turns out there is no arch in the sky. Arc-en-ciel is exactly, that's the French for arch in the sky, is exactly what it isn't. That's the French for rainbow. So in the same way, we're going to do this with consciousness. But the zombie argument says, no, you can't, because you used to have two different phenomena going on. You have the physical phenomena, and you have the subjective qualitative states. One more question, and then I'm going to answer the zombie argument. Yeah?
If we could remove the mental from the physical, and you said zombies walking around, if the mental is the higher order of the physical, does that mean that we could have a mental world where there's just thought that interacts with each other?
Yeah. There's another notion I'm going to introduce this morning, and it's called supervenience. And the idea is, no, you can't. If you can have the bodies running around with any minds, but doesn't follow that you can have minds running around without any bodies, for reasons that I haven't got to yet. We're going to get to those. Did you want another try? Okay. All right. Now let me answer the zombie argument. The picture that underlies it is this. We're to think of the universe as consisting of physical particles. Molecules themselves made of atoms, themselves made of protons, electrons, and all the rest of it. They're these real little bitty particles. Now, the idea is that consciousness somehow gets stuck on to the particles, but you could have exactly those particles behaving in the way they do without any consciousness. Now, I'm sure that is a wrong picture of the particles. The point is this. The picture that a lot of philosophers have is that we're to think of the universe as consisting of particles, sort of like grains of sand. They're like pieces of sand. And what happens is sometimes the sand is blowing one way and another times is blowing another way. Now that's the wrong picture. The laws that describe the behavior of the basic elements don't describe something that exists independently of the laws, but the laws are partly, or in some cases entirely, constitutive of the ontology of the elements. When, to put it metaphorically, when God created electrons, she didn't first create electrons and then decide to give them a negative charge. When she created electrons, or maybe it's when it created electrons, the negative charge came for free, because that's, now you guys correct my physics, it's been a long time since I studied, but last time I remember looking at the electrons had a negative charge, but whether it's negative or otherwise, that's part of the definition, part of what it is to be an electron. In other words, the picture that a lot of philosophers have is that first you have all the physical particles, and then you have the physical laws. But what I'm arguing is, at the most fundamental level, the laws are constitutive of the particles. You don't first have the particles and then decide, well, we'll keep the same particles but change the electric charges. No, that's part of what it is to be that type of particle. Indeed, the metaphor of particle is probably the wrong metaphor here. I don't know if string or points of mass energy is the right metaphor, but the idea is not that you've got all these grains of sand, and the grains of sand could all be blowing the same way they always blow, only there's no spirits going along with them, no consciousness going along with them. That's a false picture. The laws that describe the behavior at the most fundamental level define the phenomenon whose behavior they are describing. And I give you the example of the electron. The charge of the electron is part of what it is to be an electron. So the idea that these guys have is that the entire physical history of the universe could be exactly the same, but without any consciousness, would be like saying the entire physical history of the universe could be exactly the same, but without any life, because this is part of, it's constitutive of life, that the particles are behaving in this way. Now, the analogy breaks down, as all analogies do at this point, and that is, it is an amazing fact that the physical universe gives us qualitative subjectivity. It gives us these subjective states of consciousness or awareness or feeling or what it's like. Pick your favorite metaphor. But that's just a fact. It's just a fact about our physics and our biology that we're all of us conscious. We have to start with that, and that's the datum that we have to accept. Now, again, to report my own arguments with people, I find neurobiologists more willing to accept that than a lot of philosophers. A lot of philosophers just have a problem with the idea that a chunk of meat can have feelings, can have these subjective qualitative feelings. Well, it does. And that's just a datum that we have to accept. Okay, so that's my answer to the zombie argument. I wanted to get that out because it's often used against me. The way the rhetorical structure goes is this. I use a zombie argument against reductionism to show you could have a beast that looked like me and behaved like me, but was totally unconscious. Therefore, my consciousness cannot consist in my behavior or my physical structure. But it looks like if that argument is right, then you ought to be able to generalize it and say, okay, property dualism follows, because the whole universe could be like that. But then I have to go back and say, well, when I said you could have a beast like me, I did not mean that you could have a beast like me with all of its microstructure intact and all of the laws that constitute the behavior of that microstructure intact. No, you have to have a beast that looks like me and behaves like me. But if the basic physical phenomena that give rise to consciousness in the first place are the same, then you're going to have consciousness, because the laws that define the behavior of the most fundamental physical particles are, as far as we know, constitutive of the particles. Now, I might be wrong. It might turn out that when we're all dead, we find, oh, well, there are still going to be a lot of souls floating around. I'm not optimistic about that, but that's an empirical claim on my part. It's just, as far as we know how the world works, when your brain goes, your consciousness goes with it. Okay, other questions, because this is, I think, the most powerful argument against my view, is, well, it leads to property dualism. What's wrong with property dualism? Well, the short answer is it implies epiphenomenalism. It implies that consciousness doesn't make any difference. It's not a real part of the real world. But it seems to me it is a real part of the real world, and I give you the same boring examples over and over. I decide to raise my arm, and that causes the arm to go up. But that means that the conscious state that caused the arm to go up must also be a state that has all these electrochemical properties. It must be secreting acetylcholine at the axon end plates of the motor neurons. Okay, Jennifer.
Yeah, on your account, there could be life without consciousness, but
Yes.
there couldn't be
Yeah.
biological beings.
Well, okay, let's go over.
Physical law.
Jennifer says, on my view, there could be life without consciousness, and we know for a fact that there's a lot of life without consciousness. It's kind of a miracle that we have a life at all. But that, I mean, you get these big carbon-based molecules, but then plant life wasn't enough. You get these carbon-based molecules that produce animal life capable of locomotion. And capable of certain types of reproduction, particularly biparental reproduction involving members of the same species. And it's perfectly possible that there could have been a universe without that. And indeed, here's an interesting puzzle. The universe is a hell of a big place. How many planets are there? Well, we need some dinky little suburban planet in a minor solar system that no respectable God would give a damn about. You know, it's like, I don't know, worrying about Danville or someplace like that. And yet we think we're kind of a big deal, because as far as we know, we're the only consciousness in the universe. But if evolution produced it here, it's such a big place, there must be a lot of places that have consciousness. I once asked a famous biologist, an evolutionary biologist, a guy in Berkeley had a Nobel Prize, how many places are there with life like ours? And without a moment's hesitation, he said, 10 to the 6th. Now, I love that. It's fake science to begin with. Instead of saying a million, which is what any of us would, he said 10 to the 6th because it sounded like you really know what you're talking about. You know, if he said 10 to the 7th, it might have been more, it might have sounded even more scientific. But that's just a guess on his part. But the point is, it seems reasonable to suppose that we're not the only consciousness in the universe. It's unlikely that we would ever get in touch with these other consciousnesses. Most of them will be outside our light cone, so there are all kinds of problems. But Jennifer, you say some more.
Yeah, I'm just trying to see Chalmers' work was on the argument how far up the time it can go. So I imagine on your account you would say, look, as soon as you come to the point where you get the causal mechanisms for consciousness,
you're going to have consciousness.
You're going to have consciousness by physical law.
You see, here's the point. I mean, to put my point very crudely, the same physical laws that constitute the basic structure of the universe, those same physical laws will generate consciousness under certain rather special conditions. I mean, the conditions you got to have on our little Earth in order to have life at all. You know, certain amount of water, certain temperature range. Those are very special. And in order to have animal life, they're even more special. And in order to have beasts with animal life like ours, that's very special. And it is quite possible that we're busy ruining the specialness right now, that we're busy poisoning the environment in such a way as to put an end to life like ours. But in any case, for the time being, and for the past several hundred million years, we have had the capacity for life like ours, and it has evolved into human and animal consciousness. It seems likely that it would exist in other parts of the universe, but we don't know for a fact that it does. Okay, other questions? All right, well, there are whole lots of other notions I need to explain, so here go with some of them. One of the notions that you will constantly encounter in the literature is one I don't think I've said much about. Now, part of my problem is, for me, it's more fun to lecture if I don't lecture from notes. It's more like a conversation, but that means I sometimes forget what I said, but I don't think I talked about supervenience. If I did, you can go to sleep for the next 5 minutes. But anyway, those of you who aren't asleep, I'm now going to explain the notion of supervenience, because a lot of people think that's the secret of solving the mind-body problem, is to see that consciousness and intentionality as well, but consciousness especially, is supervenient on the brain. What does supervenient mean? A feature A, supervenient. And you should always check out etymology and morphology. Super means over, and venient means coming. It comes over. And the idea of supervenience is this. A is supervenient on B if, in order for there to be any change in the A properties, there has to be a change in the B properties. So you might say liquidity and solidity are supervenient on molecular behavior. You can't have a change from liquidity to solidity without a change in the molecular behavior. That's a classical case of supervenience. Now, the idea is, and this sounds right to me, that consciousness is supervenient on brain processes, that the conscious states depend on the brain in such a way that you can't have a change in a conscious state without a corresponding change in the underlying brain processes, and what's sometimes called the supervenience base. So the supervenience base of consciousness are brain processes. Any change in consciousness requires a change in brain processes. If, for example, right now I'm thirsty, and then after a few seconds I stop being thirsty, there must have been a corresponding change in my brain processes, because thirst is supervenient on the brain processes. Why is this supposed to be an important notion? Well, some philosophers, I guess, Donald Davidson is probably responsible for introducing it into this discussion. It used to be mostly or entirely in ethics. But the guy who's made a career out of supervenience is Jae-gwon Kim. And if you go to Korea, you'll discover that the most famous American philosopher is a guy you didn't know was the most famous philosopher. His name is Kim Jae-gwon. And everybody in Korea wanted to know what I thought of Kim Jae-gwon. It's like when I went to China, the first time they all wanted to know what I thought of Wang Hao. The greatest American philosopher was Wang Hao. A guy I know is Hao Wang, who taught logic he was at Rockefeller. And Jae-gwon is now, he went to Hopkins. Yeah, isn't he at Hopkins? Oh, maybe you're right. It's Brown. He went to Brown. Yeah, he's at Brown University. Anyway, Jae-gwon Kim, I gave some very good lectures in Berkeley, and you should look at them. They contain an interesting attack on me, and I suppose I should answer it at some point. But in any case, he made a lot out of supervenience. And the idea is this. Once you recognize the supervenience of consciousness on brain processes, you can have a kind of materialism, but it's non-reductive materialism. And this view was sometimes called that. It's non-reductive materialism. My own view is that supervenience adds nothing to the discussion, but you should be aware of it because you're going to see it referred to when you read books and articles. It's commonly referred to, and it's surely right to say that consciousness is supervenient on brain processes, where the definition of supervenience is any change in consciousness requires a change in brain processes, or more generally, A is supervenient. Properties of type A are supervenient on properties of type B if any change in the A properties requires a change in the B properties. That's the supervenience base. Okay, what's wrong with the notion? Well, what's wrong is this. You need to distinguish two kinds of supervenience, which I call constitutive supervenience and causal supervenience. You need to distinguish the constitutive kind from the causal kind. And to tell you a little bit about that, I have to tell you a little bit about the history. This is supposed to be over here. That there's constitutive and causal supervenience. The notion of supervenience was introduced, I first think, in the 1920s to describe ethical properties. You couldn't have two actions that were the same in all respects, except one was good and the other one was bad. One was saintly and the other one was evil. So it turns out that ethical goodness and badness are supervenient on some other properties. Similarly with aesthetic properties. You couldn't have two pictures that were identical in all respects, but one was beautiful and the other one was ugly. So beauty and ugly, like good and bad, are supervenient on other properties. Now that kind of supervenience I call constitutive supervenience, because the features of an action that make it a good action don't cause it to be good, they just constitute its being good. And the features of a picture that make it beautiful don't cause it to be beautiful, they just constitute its being beautiful. But that's no help with the mind-body relations, because the way that consciousness is supervenient on the brain is a causal relation. That is, the brain processes cause the conscious states. But that means that supervenience doesn't help us with the so-called mind-body problem. It adds nothing to the conceptual apparatus we've already got. What I've been saying is we should think of consciousness as caused by neurobiological processes, but entirely realized in the neurobiological system. Consciousness is not some separate thing that gets squirted out. It's not like a juice or a fluid that is squirted out by the brain. It's a state that the brain is in, just as the water is in a liquid state, and the liquidity is not a separate substance or phenomenon. It's a higher level state of the water molecules. In the same way, the consciousness is a higher level state of the brain. So I can't see that anything is added by the notion of supervenience. But let's stop for questions. I see Candida. Yeah.
I want to know where we can find your answer to Kim.
Well, gosh, I probably in a little book. I thinking about this lecture, I got what I thought were some terrific ideas, and then I went and looked in a book, and it turned out they were already in the book. It's called Mind, and I hope you have a copy. And if it isn't in there, come and see me, and I look up. Well, let's try. I'm not going to do it now, but look up Kim in the index. But this is my answer to him on the subject of supervenience. Now, on the subject of causation, which is where he thinks he's refuted me, I think I answered that when I talked about how the notion of causation, the standard philosopher's account of causation is radically mistaken. The standard account of causation they have is causation is always a relation between discrete events. There's this event, the cause, and that event, the effect. There was an earthquake, the Loma Prieta earthquake, and that caused the collapse of the Oakland freeway. Now, the problem with that picture of causation is it leaves out the crucial feature of causation. It's everywhere. Causation is everywhere. Right now, you're being acted on by all sorts of causal forces. Most obviously, gravity. But gravity does not name an event. My body is exerting pressure against the floor, and there's a cause of that, the force of gravity, but gravity does not name a discrete event. So it's a condition of the world, the permanence of gravitational attraction, which causally accounts for lots of things, and it's a condition of my brain that causally accounts for its being conscious. But those aren't two discrete events. Rather, it is different levels of description of one and the same system. Okay, any other questions at this point? Because I'm going to go on. Yes? I couldn't hear you.
You said that supervenience can prove like a non-reductive.
Yeah, the idea, I'm not sure I understand these guys, but here's the picture that they had. The question was, in what sense does supervenience prove non-reductive materialism? The idea is that you're going to say, look, there's just the brain. And in that sense, it's materialist. But the relationship of consciousness to the brain is one of supervenience. So it's non-reductive. You don't say there's nothing but the brain. You recognize that there is a property that supervenes on brain processes. Okay, that's the non-reductive materialism. Now, why that's non-reductive, I don't see, unless you want to say, well, you're not eliminating consciousness, in which case it seems to me that usual charge of property dualism is going to hold. But my deep objection to that is it leaves out the crucial feature. Brain processes have to cause this conscious state. There has to be a causal functioning by which the brain is conscious or not conscious. And if you think brain processes can't cause consciousness, well, I do it every night by putting Cabernet Sauvignon or some similar substance into my nervous system, and it does alter my states of consciousness. I'm not recommending you try this yourself, but there are various ways of altering your consciousness through the use of chemistry. It happens all the time. Jennifer.
Yeah, but as you're aware, the question is, at what level is the consciousness really functioning? The causal component, which for you is one and the same associated with the physical. And if if mental states really do have causal powers, then in what lies the causation?
Okay, this is the crucial question. How do I avoid epiphenomenalism? If I'm going to say that the conscious decision to raise my arm, cause my arm to go up, the charge is going to be, how could it? It hasn't got an electrical charge. It doesn't squirt out neurotransmitters. And the answer is, it does. And I gave you the proof last time, and I think the profession hasn't appreciated this proof, so I got to become even more boring than I have been. But the way it goes is this. My conscious intention and action caused my arm to go up. And my blackboard urge is overcoming me here. The IA caused the bodily movement, but we know that anything that caused the bodily movement in that way must cause the secretion of acetylcholine, right? No acetylcholine, no bodily movement. Acetylcholine is one of the first neurotransmitters discovered. When I first got into this field, we only knew about 5 neurotransmitters. Now there must be at least 50, and it keeps growing all the time. But anyway, acetylcholine, you've got to squirt out acetylcholine, but then anything that squirts out acetylcholine has to be a neurobiological, neurophysiological phenomenon. But now those premises, I won't write them out on the blackboard, those premises entail the intention and action is a neurobiological phenomenon. And the answer is it is. It has a higher and lower level of description. The same event that squirts out the acetylcholine, in squirting out the acetylcholine, causes your arm to go up. And that's because one and the same event has different levels of description. At the higher level, it is a conscious experience of acting. It's a conscious intention and action. At the lower level, it's got a whole lot of specific neurobiological features, most of which we don't even know. But that, I said, is not a mystery. That's exactly like your car engine. It's the explosion in the cylinder that causes the engine to start. If you don't get an explosion in the cylinder, you won't get the crankshaft to turn over in such a way as to keep the engine going. But we know perfectly well that what actually is going on is that hydrocarbons are being oxidized. So at the bottom level, you have an oxidization of the hydrocarbons. At the top level, you have an explosion in the cylinder. Now I'm saying that in exactly the same way, at the bottom level of one and the same event, it's not two different events, there's one and the same event. At the bottom level, you have the secretion of acetylcholine. At the top level, you have the conscious trying, which produces a movement of the arm. And this is throughout nature, that there are different levels of description of one and the same system. They don't describe two different phenomena, two different events. They describe the same event at different levels. Now, the metaphor of lower and higher may be misleading to us, and I'll say a bit about that in a minute. Yes, say some more. Keep doing it. Keep probing.
What worries me is that the car engine really is totally explicable at all levels.
Yes.
At the causation, the car doesn't at the lower level. We can't, at any level, we can't talk about the wheeling. The car doesn't
Yeah.
wheel.
Okay. Yeah.
And you can't reduce the wheeling. This is the one element that can't be reduced down to the neurological level.
Willing?
Yeah.
Well, I think, causally speaking, it can. Causally speaking, when I decide to raise my arm, there has to be a whole lot of neurobiological processes, and those neurobiological processes cause and realize this experience. Now, we've now raised a separate problem, though, and I haven't answered that one yet, and that's free will. Because if you grant me, look, okay, consciousness of pains and tickles and itches, that's all neurobiological. But when you consciously and freely decide to do something, then you've got something that stands outside the causal network. And that's because you got free will. Now, I'm not ready to tell you about free will. If I can solve the problem of consciousness today, we'll save free will for Thursday, or maybe even it'll be after Easter. It's going to take a while to get the free will is a bitch. Well, I don't want to use technical terms. But it's a hard question. But I agree. I haven't solved the problem of free will. But give me consciousness, and then we'll get to free will later. Here's one of the problems about free will is this. There are a whole lot of guys now who think we're establishing scientifically that consciousness just goes along for the ride. See, a lot of people think Libet's experiments show that you think your consciousness caused your arm to go up, but in fact the brain made up its mind, if I may so speak, to raise your arm 300 milliseconds before you ever became aware of it. So this consciousness that you say raised your arm, that's just going along for the ride. The brain did it, and you just sort of riding on this horse, and the horse goes any way it wants to go. Think of consciousness on this picture as like the froth on the wave that comes on the beach. Now, if you're the froth, you think, I got a tough job. I got to take these damn waves on the beach, and then I got to take them back in the water again. And you got to do it all day long, 24/7, 365. There's no rest for us froth. But we know that froth doesn't make any difference. It goes along for the ride. Now that's the picture that a lot of people have, is that consciousness is just like the froth on the wave. That's wrong. I'm pretty sure that's wrong. But I haven't answered all of those arguments. In fact, I haven't even told you all the arguments. But we'll get to that when we get to free will. Okay, we're not there yet. Now we're still struggling with supervenience and the mind-body problem. Now, I don't know how much time did I leave myself. Well, let's keep going. Another notion that you sometimes hear is emergent properties. And the idea is, well, consciousness is real, all right, and it depends on the brain, but it's an emergent property. It emerges out of the brain. Now, I think there is a respectable notion of emergent property, whereby you can think of the solidity of the table as an emergent property. Once you have the molecules moving in a certain way, then the table will support other objects in a way that a gas won't support objects. So there is a notion of an emergent property. And in that sense, it seems to me consciousness is an emergent property. Just stating the geometry of the neurons won't imply the existence of consciousness any more than just stating the geometry of physical particles won't imply solidity. You have to have certain causal relations. So you get a kind of causal emergence in the case of both solidity and consciousness. But I think the people who cared about this, and there was a group of philosophers called the English or the British emergentists in the 1920s and 30s, and they thought the brain creates consciousness, but once created, it has a kind of life of its own, and that's why we have free will. Its consciousness goes around with its own life. I can't make any sense out of that. So in the text I've asked you to read, I distinguish emergent 1 and emergent 2. Sorry to have such unimaginative names for them, and I forget which is which. But there's one which is respectable that says, sure, consciousness is an emergent property of the brain in the sense that causal processes in the brain cause the brain to be in a conscious state, and consciousness functions causally. But it does not break loose from the brain. It remains supervenient. So these two notions, in my jargon, tend to go together. Now, in his attacks on me, Jae-Gwon Kim says, well, that's a very eccentric use of the notion of emergent. It probably is. I don't care. It seems to me I can make that respectable. But the idea that consciousness is squirted out by the brain and then has a life of its own, I can't make that respectable. I can't make that intellectually respectable. It's always going to remain dependent on the brain in the same way that liquidity and solidity are dependent on their supervenience base. They're dependent on what's happening at the level of the molecules. Okay, with all that said, let's go to work and now describe consciousness. I mean, we're all conscious. What are the features of consciousness that serve to define it? What are its essential features? Now, every time I do this, I come up with a bigger list. And I think in the text that you have, I come up with about a dozen features. But let's get going and see what we find. The features of consciousness. Well, okay, the most important feature, the one that serves to define it, is ontological subjectivity. Conscious states only exist insofar as they're experienced by a human or animal subject. Maybe you can make a conscious machine. Nobody knows how to do it yet. Nobody's done it yet. Now, with subjectivity goes qualitativeness, because for every subjective state, there's something that it feels like to be in that state. Just to have a noun here, let's qualitativeness. There's a certain what it's like, to use Tom Nagel's expression, feature to any conscious state. And that's part of the definition of consciousness. And this is why it makes sense to ask, well, what did it feel like to be Princess Diana on the day of her death? Whereas it doesn't make sense to say, what does it feel like to be this glass of water about to be drunk? because it doesn't feel like anything. There's no consciousness. Okay, so qualitativeness and subjectivity seem to be two crucial features. Now, a third one, which is crucially important, we haven't said anything about yet, is unity. Any conscious state is part of a unified conscious field. So I don't, now for example, I don't just hear the sound of my voice and feel the weight of my body against the floor and taste the water, but I have all of those as part of a single big unified conscious field. And that seems to be essential. The way to see it's essential is this. If you imagine your consciousness broken into 17 bits, you're not imagining one consciousness in 17 pieces. You'd be imagining 17 different types of consciousness, 17 different consciousnesses, if that's a word. That is, consciousness always a conscious state always comes to us as part of a big conscious state, as part of a total conscious field. This is why the split brain research is so important to us. I told you about a single type of experiment. We'll say more about them later, but remember how it goes. You show an object, in this case it's a spoon, you show it to the hemisphere where the guy has, you show it to the part of the visual field where the guy can see it, but the left hemisphere doesn't see it, only the right hemisphere. So you show it to the left eye, to the part of the left eye, I won't tell you the whole the physical structure of the optic chiasma, but in any case, the right half of the brain sees it, but the left half of the brain doesn't see it. And then you ask the guy, what do you see? And the guy says with language, which is on the left half of his brain. He's got, like most of us have language on the left side, not on the right side. He says, I don't see anything. And then he reaches out with his left hand, which is controlled by the right side of his brain where he can see it, and he grabs the spoon. He grabs it even though he's saying sincerely, I don't see anything. Does everybody get the picture? All right. Now, there are lots of cases like this, and the guy to look them up, if you're Googling this, is look up split brain, and the two authors that are most famous are Roger Sperry and Mike Gazzaniga. Gazzaniga used to teach in Davis, but he's gone back east now, so I can't bring him around. But in any case, these are very interesting experiments because what it suggests is there are two consciousnesses in there. You've got a left brain consciousness and a right brain conscious, and in the normal human being, those are united in a single conscious field. In the same way your eyeballs unite your visual experiences. Though you got two eyes, they're united. You can break up the unity by pushing one eyeball, and then you'll see everything double. But in the same way, you've got two consciousnesses that tend to coalesce. And what you get in Mike's experiments, where the patients have the corpus callosum cut, is you get a separation. You get a break in the unity. So apparently there are two guys in there, and they communicate with each other only imperfectly. But for the rest of us, where the corpus callosum is hooked up, the corpus callosum is the big body of tissue that connects the left brain to the right brain. Consciousness, we have a single unified consciousness in our brain. Now, those of you who know anything about the history of philosophy will remember Immanuel Kant made a big deal about the unity of consciousness. He called it the transcendental unity of apperception, and he was correct in saying it's a crucial feature of consciousness. And there is an interesting problem in neurobiology, which we'll talk about later, and that is, how does the brain do it? You got all this stuff coming in, and it comes in and it stimulates different parts of the brain. How does the brain produce a unified conscious field? That's got a name. It's called the binding problem. And in fact, there are different binding problems. One binding problem is when I see an object, the parts of my brain that are stimulated by the color are different from the parts stimulated by the shape. How the hell does the brain put it all together into a single unified experience? So the binding problem, I think that neurobiologists are correct to see, is a crucial problem for any account of the neurobiology of consciousness. Okay, now I used to think these are three different phenomena, I now think they're really different aspects of the same thing. Essentially, the brain produces qualitative, unified subjectivity, and you can't have one without the other. If you've got a subjective state, that implies qualitativeness. The subjective state is going to have a qualitative feel, and the subjective qualitativeness imply unity. So these are really just one feature. There are three different aspects of the one feature. But now this next feature is the one that really, it relates us to the rest of the world, and that's intentionality. And a great deal of this course is going to be devoted to intentionality. So now I'll just say intentionality is that feature of the mind by which we are related to, by which we have states that are related to or about or of objects and states of affairs in the world. I can now think there's unrest in Libya, and my thoughts reach all the way to Libya. Or I can think it's raining in Beijing, and my thoughts reach all the way to Beijing, and yet it takes no effort at all. How is that possible? How can what's going on inside my skull be about anything? And this produces another kind of philosophical worry, like consciousness. A guy sent me an email, well-known philosopher, an email that said, really, intentionality must be an illusion. How can a piece of meat be about anything? Well, if you describe it that way, that's like saying, how can a piece of meat be conscious? But if you ask, how can I now be thirsty? Well, then it seems less mysterious. If you ask, how can I now be awake? That seems less mysterious. But we're going to say more about aboutness, because aboutness is this crucial feature. And it is, from an evolutionary point of view, it's the most marvelous thing about consciousness in the brain. It enables us to take in a prodigious amount of information, process it simultaneously, and then act on the basis of the processing. And that we're going to examine in some detail. Okay, a fifth feature is mood. Whenever you're in a conscious state, you're in some mood or other. It needn't be a mood that has a name, like despair or elation or ecstasy or anxiety. But for any conscious state you're in, there's a kind of flavor to the conscious state. And you can detect the pervasiveness of mood, if you think of how rapidly your mood can change. You're sitting there with a pile of letters, and you open one up that's from the Internal Revenue Service, that says you're now 3 years overdue and a felony charge will be issued against you immediately. Okay, that will alter your mood. Once I was throwing out a lot of junk mail, and there was one that actually had a first-class stamp on it from some damn law firm in Los Angeles. I opened the letter, and it contained a check for $9,782.41, or something, about $10,000. And a little note attaching, say, somebody used the Chinese room argument in violation of your copyright. There was a class action suit of a whole lot of people, and this is your share of the funds. Well, that changed my mood, I can tell you. You see, I suddenly thought, if those people had written me a letter and said, can we use a Chinese room argument? I would have said, of course, use it for nothing. As it was, I got $10,000. Well, anyway, it changed my mood. That's the point. The point I'm making now is not about copyright. That's another lecture, but about the pervasiveness of mood. And I think all conscious states come in some mood or other. Mood is not the same as emotion. We'll talk about emotions. But the mood will predispose you to having an emotion. If you're in a foul mood, which is a mood, you may more easily get angry, which is an emotion. If you're in a good mood, you may be loving and cheerful, which, or at least loving, being in love is an emotion. Now, to show the capacity of the brain to process a whole lot of things simultaneously, I'm going to both finish this sentence and remark that the hour is up. So simultaneously, the lecture's over. Please.